Greetings, Embers, newbies, and the peekaboos. Welcome to Back to Ashes. I am your host, Phoenix. Before we begin, if you enjoy the way I narrate these stories, a subscribe, like, comment, or share would be appreciated. Also, before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge the elite members of Back to Ashes. Thank each and every last one of you for your continued support. You are the pillars that hold this channel up, and I cannot show my gratitude enough. If you are interested in becoming a member of the channel or would like to buy me a coffee during these cold months, those links can be found down below. Without further ado, it is time to go back to ashes. For once we arise from those ashes, we are a bigger, brighter, stronger, and a happier person every day. Sit back, relax, kick back, grab a snack, or tuck in and get warm, and prepare for your dose of vocal melatonin entitled True Scary Stories and Creepy Encounters. Right after this intro, an ad will play. I'll read the first story an ad will play, and after that there will be no more ads within this video. Disclaimer, this video is for educational and entertainment purposes. I'm not that great of an author or storyteller, so pretend I'm just talking to you conversationally or something like that. I was out in Oregon in 2019 on some friend's 300-acre property in the middle of nowhere, and it was the second day during sunset when the lights get real orange when all 6 of us were sitting on the benches around the fire pit shooting crap, and 2 of my friends who brought their kids were making s'mores. I felt really comfy in my fancy padded folded chair and just kind of zoned out, looking into the forest. I was staring out into space a long time before I noticed one of the trees had a large hand grabbed around it. I froze and my arms shot up with goosebumps, and I said to, let's call him Greg, but that's not his name, look exactly where I'm pointing and focus on that tree. There's a hand. He didn't see it for a while and I got frustrated, but then he said something like, holy shit. There it is. It was big fingers wrapped around the tree, and they looked almost like tree bark. Like, imagine some really dark skin with small ridges and cracks that look very close to tree bark. But it was a huge hand. This was about 15 meters away. Both of us just stare at it, and it doesn't move for a good 8 minutes, and suddenly, its grip loosened and disappeared behind the tree. Me and Greg just looked at each other, dumbfounded, and later walked up to the tree. And this tree is huge, like at least 2 feet in circumference. And this hand was holding it like a hammer. No imprints on the ground, no smell like if an animal had been there. There's something huge out there in the forests of Northeast Oregon, and it blends in too well. I was 10. I was meeting friends at an electronics store. The employees were nice to let us watch movies on the big TVs. All of a sudden, I see a crazy old man walking 3 huge brown and black dogs without a leash. The dogs, at full speed, jumped on me, and I hit my head on the concrete. I wake up. My legs are full of bites, and dogs are licking my blood. Then workers from a flower shop are dragging me and scaring off the dogs. They ask me questions to bring me back to a normal state. What's my name? What's my number? Etc. The crazy old man is trying to take me with him. The flower shop workers are asking, do I know this man? I'm crying. I'm saying no. Please don't leave me with him. His dogs are going to eat me alive. The crazy old man is trying to pick me up and take me like a sack of potatoes. The flower shop workers are fighting him. He is screaming, they will make me euthanize my dogs. Eventually, my mom with an ambulance shows up. The crazy old man flees. I go to the hospital. They are giving me a bunch of rabies shots. Some of the bites are bone deep. I'm scared. I'm shaking. I was jumpy for an entire month after that. The crazy old man, turns out, owns the construction company my dad works at. He lives in a mansion with 15 dogs. He converses my dad to not press any charges in exchange for a promotion and a pay raise. 6 months later, my dad's contract was not renewed. He tries to contact the crazy old man. A secretary asked my dad to stop harassing the old crazy man. This is a strategy rich people do to avoid lawsuits. My dad told me my mom, he felt like he failed me as a parent. My dad moved us to a new place more suitable for raising children. But this new place had no immigrants, so racism was brutal. I studied marine biology. I worked at sea. Since I didn't feel homesick for neither place I grew up, a man without land, so to speak. I'm not sure if my story is 100% scary, but it certainly is interesting, creepy, and very odd. The house that my parents owned when I was born was built during the war years. I had always heard that a lot of type of homes were built to house war workers and their families, which is also how the other side of my family came to live nearby due to my grandparents working in war production. My parents bought the house in the early 1960s and were the second owners. The original owners who bought the house brand new in the 1940s were a childless couple, and my parents said they would sometimes come over way before I was born to visit their old house. The house was small. It was a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house on a lot big enough to expand, so back in the 1970s, my parents expanded the house to add on a family room, dining room, and closet space. The add-on was very obvious because the main part of the original house was raised foundation, and the add-on was on concrete pad. There was a step down to go to the add-on. This add-on was built before I was born too, or I may have been just born and a baby. My parents only had said the 70s was when the add-on was built. The add-on was always the subject of family lore, so the versions I heard was that the guys my dad hired to lay the foundation had dug up some weird items as they were about to pour the concrete. My dad had had them add patio off the add-on too, so they had pretty much our entire backyard dug up, leveled and ready to pour foundation and patio space. Like I said, I wasn't there when all of this was happening, or maybe a baby. However, there was always talk about the stuff that was dug up during the construction, like items including wood, bits of strange metal, pottery, and even jewelry. Fast forward to when I was in elementary school and a kid. As any boy, I would like to dig in the backyard and play. This always made my mom extremely upset. I could pretty much do anything else back there but dig. Well, one time I was playing with my Hot Wheels and I wanted to make dirt tracks for them. So I went to the side of my house where my mom couldn't see, and I started digging in the dirt. I found small pottery items and what looked like glass beads and a side of board that was super old. My older brother had found me and told on me. With my mom, she got so angry that she told me to throw it away, cover up the dirt, and never dig here again. It wasn't until the year when we moved away from that house that I was a bit older and started to really pay attention on what could have been out there. For context, there was always a spookiness to our add-on. Like when I was a kid or my siblings, no one wanted to stay down there alone. Even one time, we had a cousin who was about a year older than me, asleep over, and my mom had one of those sofa beds from the 1980s that was huge, and she put him to sleep there. He ended up not making it through the night and put a blanket in our room and slept on the floor. He said he heard strange noises. We all heard that. Saw weird shadows and would hear scratching at the windows sometimes. Also, I never played in the backyard at night. I never liked to be out there after dark. So, the year we moved away from that house, I overheard my mom and dad finally start to tell that there may have been an unmarked grave or graves on that land that were never discovered when the attractive homes were built. Apparently, back in the 1800s, large plots of land in that area were owned by dairy farmers. Before the war, the land was just open space, as the farmers eventually moved out of the area. Even before that, the area had a different name and was only changed as cities were formed in the 1910s and the 1920s. So, the home I was born into and lived when I was in middle school may have had unmarked graves right underneath it. I worked in the radiology department in a hospital in Cardiff, Wales, UK, for about 3 years as an admin and clerical officer before getting a promotion working in medicine. During these 3 years, I saw a lot of things, ranging from patients dying in the MRI scanners to patients having an x ray for inserting a meat thermometer into their urethra. Nights always seemed the craziest. One time, a patient came in with armed police after an altercation, which involved a knife in the middle of the city center, and just so happened the person he had the altercation with was having an x ray too. This caused a second altercation right in front of me. Chairs were thrown, a trash bin or two, and then wheelchair. So I have seen things, some funny, some stressful, some sad, and many bonkers. But this one night, something scary. I would start a night shift at around 1900, then would work until 0830 the next morning. This was the standard night shift for our department. We would usually do 3 nights in a row before doing 4 days off. After the third night, you were ready to sleep for a week. The strange thing was this was my first night of the 3, so not at all tired. It started off normal. I arrived at the department, took over for the day shift, logged into my PC. During this time, we usually would set up our phones, our tablets, to watch movies or the latest TV series, as there would be a lot of downtime between patients. Like I said, the first few hours, nothing that interesting. Just your average run-of-the-mill night in radiology. Then it came to my break. Now, before I tell you more, I should probably explain the layout of this hospital. This hospital is the largest in Wales. It's a teaching hospital and it's pretty old. Now, the best way to get from A to B in the hospital is through what we call the tunnels or the catacombs. This consists of very dimly lit corridors, old abandoned rooms, tunnels, and other creepy, decrepit areas. The morgue is also found in these corridors, so it's not a nice place to be during the day, let alone the middle of the night. But it's the quickest way to get places, if you're staff. There's always been rumors and mumblings of strange things happening in these tunnels. Some people say they have seen ghosts in old-fashioned porter uniforms taking wheelchairs to pick up patients. Others say they have seen shadows following them from the corner of their eyes. But one person has claimed they were attacked by persons wearing an old nurse's uniform from the 70s. This place is creepy, even the best of times. But for me, never really fazed me. I've been down these hundreds of times before the worst experience up to this point was having a shoeless pipe drip human waste onto my head. That in itself was a horror show. But tonight would be something altogether different, and maybe not even of this physical world. Like I said before, it was a very quiet night. I had been watching the latest series of One Piece because I'm a geek. During my downtime, then a radiographer or radiology technician for my American friends out there came to take over and cover for my break. I decided to go to the 5th floor where the sanctuary, multi-faith chapel, was located. On a night shift, it was one of the most peaceful places in the hospital. But to get there, I had to walk through the tunnels to reach the nearest elevator. I set off on my journey, which would usually take about 15 minutes, scanned my key card on the main entrance to the tunnels, then proceeded to walk through. 2 minutes in, I started to feel like someone was walking behind me. It being a busy hospital and basically the tunnels acted like the hallway, I didn't think anything of it. Suddenly, I heard panting, like someone was trying to catch their breath after going for an intense run. So I turned around to check and saw nothing. A bit strange, but thought it was nothing. Maybe just one of those pipes above my head creaking or a generator pumping. So I carried on walking, but I kept feeling like someone or something was watching me and was walking behind me. Out of sheer confusion and fear, I missed my turn towards the elevators and found myself in a large section of the tunnels that I had never seen before. Littered with old stretchers, beds, hospital furniture, and equipment. Some of this stuff was over 50 years old, maybe even older, just left to decay in a dark, smelly, decrepit, and dusty corridor. This was starting to really creep me out because in all of this confusion, I realized I was lost. It almost felt like I had fallen into the back rooms. Everything looked the same. I could feel a tightening in my chest and could feel the start of a panic attack coming on. I remember clutching my chest and running down a corridor, trying to find a sign, poster, or something to tell me where I was. The sense that something was watching me got stronger. Suddenly, I felt something hit my arm in force, almost like someone using a baseball bat. I remember falling to the ground, pulled myself across the floor towards the cold, dusty wall, and looked around frantically, trying to find an explanation to what the hell just hit me. Then, something caught my eye. It was almost like a black mist with glowing red eyes. It was about 20 meters away from me, just hovering in the middle of the corridor. Was this the thing that had been stalking me the entire time? I got back up and sprinted. I ran down what felt like 100 different corridors until I found a housekeeper, or the janitor. He asked me what was wrong because I looked pale, but I couldn't get any words out. He then grabbed me by both arms with a firm grip and said, "Did you see it too?" That was the last time I ever stepped foot in the tunnels. To this day, I hear rumors of strange things. I'm not sure what I saw that night. Maybe I was tired, maybe I was stressed, maybe it was something else. What else would the janitor ask me if I had seen it too? What else is down there? Well, I can tell you one thing for sure. I won't be going down to find out. Thank you for listening to my story. All right, dear listeners, this is a part 2 to the story that I just read, so I'm going to go ahead and read straight through. I decided to do a bit of research and investigate the experiences and stories from others who have worked in the hospital that I had my strange and creepy encounter in. Like in my previous story, I had heard many rumors and stories of people experiencing weird and strange things. This was my starting point to find out what was really in the tunnels under that hospital. This story will explain the new experience I had while exploring those tunnels with my friend who also works in a hospital. A bit of background in case you missed the first story. The hospital I work in is the biggest one in Wales of the UK, in the capital city of Cardiff. It's pretty old and many of the areas are unused and in a state of disrepair. As it's a big place, it's very easy to get lost in and can be very difficult to find your way out. There are a network of tunnels underneath the hospital where the morgue is located, and many abandoned rooms and corridors. It's dark, warm, smelly, dusty, and pretty darn creepy. This is where I had my own creepy encounter with something dark. I won't go into all of that now. It's all in my original story. Definitely worth listening to. I decided that I wasn't going to ever step foot in those tunnels again. But I changed my mind for, we'll just say, science. This is where my friend comes into the picture. I decided if I was going to actively investigate the tunnels, I would need at least one extra person. So, who better to ask than my friend Ryan? Ryan is a tall, stocky gym guy, so at least I had a bodyguard. He also works for security, so he's got a fairly decent idea of the layout of the tunnels. Perfect. Ryan doesn't believe in ghosts or unearthly things. Well, he didn't until today. I had heard a story of a girl who was thought to haunt a couple of the abandoned rooms under the old children's wards. The children's hospital has a new shiny building on the other side of the campus. So these children's wards are new storage rooms and patient file libraries. We decided to meet up in the evening to go explore the area of tunnel, as this was a hive for strange phenomena, and maybe if we had some extra time, we would try some of the other active areas of the tunnel. We met outside the tunnel entrance at 2100 hours and made a plan of action. Firstly, we go make our way to the old area of the tunnels and rooms where this girl was said to be seen. Secondly, we explore a little as some of the equipment and furniture in the rooms were really old. Finally, we would sit in the middle of one of the rooms and just see what would happen. Simple. Then, if we had time, we would just go for a wander. Like I said before, I had an experience in the tunnel a bit over a year ago now, which is still fresh in my memory. But I have Ryan here, so I'm sure everything will be fine. We scanned our cards and the doors to the tunnels opened. I won't lie, I was very much on edge. We started to walk into the tunnels and made our way through the first few sections. Then, suddenly, we realized we were in the old area of the building. It then hit me like a ton of bricks. The reality of what I was doing. Am I crazy? I said to myself. No, this is for science. We got closer and closer to the section of tunnel we were planning on going. The tunnels were dark and poorly lit. Ryan had to pull out his torch. It got that dark. Ryan then shone his torch on the wall, and you can see old paintings of animals, clowns, a circus, and old painted faces that the children who attended the hospital painted and stuck onto the walls. Perfect setting for a horror movie, isn't it? If I'm being honest, yeah, it was creepy. But I kind of expected something like this, so we carried on going. We finally got to the section of the tunnels we were wanting to get to. We looked around a little and noticed a few doors. Two were padlocked. One had a padlock that had rusted and was hanging on by a thread. The other door had been rotted to basically dust. We put on our face masks because we are careful, guys. and because black mold and asbestos are real things, and proceed to enter the rotten doorway. Ryan flashed his torch around, but there wasn't much to see in there. Maybe a couple of chairs and an old desk. Nothing worthwhile. So we moved to the next room. I pulled the rusted padlock, which disintegrated in my hands, then pushed the door open. And I mean, man, the smell that hit us from that room was disgusting. There was a moldy, sticky liquid covering the whole of the floor. We noticed old gallon jerry cans of iodine and other chemicals that had spilled all over the floor, and the countless carcasses of dead mice and rats that littered the floor was crazy. We decided to skip the room and try one of the more secure doors. This is where things got really creepy. Ryan decided he would ram one of the old doors with his shoulder, thinking it would dislodge the old hinges and make the door swing open. It didn't. Instead, we heard what sounded like a tapping coming from the other side of the door. Ryan looked at the door thinking it was just a dripping pipe on the other side of the door, or maybe it was a rat or something nibbling on the door panel. He did it in the typical da-dun, da-da-da, da-dun, da-dun beat. The tapping instantly stopped. We waited a couple of seconds, but as Ryan went to knock on the door again, the exact beat knocked back at us. Da-dun, da-da-da, da-dun, da-dun, da-dun. I froze and turned and locked eyes with Ryan, and the utter shock in his face told me he had probably made a massive mistake. Suddenly, before we had a chance to run, Ryan passed out and fell in my arms. I wanted to run and leave him there, but he's my mate, and I know he wouldn't do that for me. So I started to drag him away from the door. The knocking stopped, and there was just complete silence. A couple of seconds after, Ryan started to wake up. Then suddenly he shot up and screamed, "Manon!" I jumped a mile and said, "What are you talking about?" He said back to me, "Manon. It's Manon." I looked at him and saw he was staring into the darkness at the end of the tunnel. I realized Manon was the girl who was supposed to have haunted the area. Maybe she was the one knocking the door back at us. I told Ryan we should probably find our way out. We both stood up and slowly shuffled away from the door. As we turned to face the way we came, the door knocked again, and the handle started to turn. At that point, I tapped out and started running to the exit. Ryan running beside me, we decided to go the longer way as the shortcut had more dark areas and at least the longer way was fairly well lit. But as we got to the cross junction, Ryan turned back and screamed. I had never heard him scream before. He turned me around. There in the middle of the corridor was a floating black mist with glowing red eyes. The exact same thing I saw before. The face contorted and almost had a childlikeness to it. It screamed and wailed at us, then just vanished. We couldn't get out of that tunnel quick enough. We managed to go to the exit and we just fell to the floor and just looked at each other. We both agreed not to tell anyone we work with about this, but decided to get help from the hospital chaplains. But that thing was Manon. Again, thank you for listening to my story. Around 15 years ago, I lived in Chicago and worked at a restaurant in the Loop where I sometimes worked split shifts, i.e., work the lunch rush, then come back a few hours for dinner. I didn't usually like to go home in between, as naturally, Once I get settled, the last thing I wanted to do was go back to work. So if it was nice, I'd walk around downtown, sit and listen to music in the park, etc. If it wasn't, I would literally just get on the L to ride around and read or listen to music for a while. One day, it's the later scenario, and I'm riding what's a sparsely populated train as it was afternoon on a weekday. I'm on the inside seat of two facing forward, and a guy who just boarded the train plops himself down next to me, even though there are plenty of empty seats elsewhere. There was nothing particularly objectionable about him. Just seemed like an average guy, probably in his mid to late 20s. I was annoyed he chose to sit down next to me when there were other places to sit comfortably, obviously. But before I had barely registered my annoyance, he lets out one of those giant dad sneezes. Everyone in the car turned to look at him, which is probably good for what followed. He had covered his mega sneeze with his hand, and, to my disgust, he extended out that hand to introduce himself. I did not accept the handshake, but said hi and maybe give him an awkward elbow bump. He seemed affronted by this, but continued to try and make conversation with me loudly. He quickly started asking personal questions like what I did for work, where I lived, where I grew up, how long I had been in the city, etc. Clearly, he was trying to gauge both my naivety and my income. So I was vague at first and eventually just stopped answering altogether. He then gave me a sob story about how he was on hard times and maybe I could spare him some money. I didn't really believe this as, despite the sneeze, he had nice clothes and was well groomed. When I told him I had no cash on me, he said, "Well, I'll bet you got a 30-day transit pass, so you could give me that?" Maybe I should have just given it to him, but the 30 days had just started, and I made next to nothing for living in Chicago. Like hell was I going to fork it over. So I declined, and he says, "Listen, I wasn't going to tell you this, but I have a way of getting what I want." Obviously, I'm getting scared now, but as I mentioned, he was talking loudly, so the other people on the car were subtly paying attention without getting involved to this point. At the next stop, a bigger crowd was on the platform, and I used this opportunity to get off, cross over to head back the other direction. The guy got up and made to follow me off, and some of the people who knew what was happening strategically got in his way, and soon the crowd was boarding, and he wasn't able to get off before the doors closed. Phew, that was a close call. But wait, there's always more. Fast forward several months later. I can't recall the scenario exactly, but I was eating dinner quickly by myself at a Qdoba nearby where I worked. I was either in between shifts again or done for the day, and I needed a break from our food. I was facing out the windows to the sidewalk, back a bit, and not at the ones directly against the window. I see a guy outside hassling someone who doesn't appear to know as I'm sitting there eating my burrito. There's something familiar about him, but I can't put my finger on it. Soon, he leaves the other person alone and turns his head to look directly at me. And then I remembered it was the bulky from the L all those months ago. He creepily smiles at me and, to my horror, walks into the restaurant. I'm just sitting there like, there's no way this guy remembers me, when very clearly, I'm not his only target. I think maybe that's not who it was, or he saw someone else. But nope, he comes and stands right next to me. He says something along the lines of, Well, that looks good. Remember me? I told you I have a way of getting what I want. Let me have that burrito. If I weren't a brat, I would have said, doesn't seem you're very good at it, seeing as you didn't get anything off me or that guy outside. But I'm more of a freeze response type, so I just ignore him. Kept eating, and since there are other people in the restaurant, I gamble he won't make a scene. I started to get worried as he seemed to be trying to wait me out. But I am an extremely stubborn when I put my mind to something. And I was not going to leave that restaurant before him. I ate very slow, got refills, got more napkins. He tried to pretend like we were friendly, trying to make casual conversation, but I kept ignoring him. Finally, he got distracted by another mark outside, but before he left, he said to me, "I'll see you again sometime." Once I was certain he was not lurking around, I waited for a crowd and fell in to make my way towards the L and home. Thankfully, I never saw him again. I'm certain his story about being homeless was not true. Even though months of cold weather had passed and we were well into winter when I saw him the second time, he was still nicely dressed and well groomed. It kind of seemed like he had ditched that story anyway and was taking a more aggressive tact. It honestly didn't scare me as much as it flummoxed me. He reminded me not only of the song I titled my poster after, but also Debo from the movie Friday. Just an old school bully with no real motivation other than to intimidate people. And of course, what were the odds of running into him again in a different part of the city, and that he'd remember me after all this time? In retrospect, though, I should have been more scared. He wasn't just a run-of-the-mill common criminal on the streets of Chicago. Something was off. At the time, though, my mental health was in a bad place, and I was making minimum wage in an expensive city. It didn't seem unreasonable to me to risk my life and limb for my transit pass or dinner. I got lucky. Yes, I made some calculated risks, but still, it wasn't worth it, and I hope my kids wouldn't make that same call or be in a position where they would have to. But at any rate, I hope to never see that piece of scum again. This happened 4 years back. It was the middle of winter, and the night was unreasonably warm, without a hint of snow on the ground. I left my apartment around 8 p.m. to go for my daily walk. I worked nights and my schedule was screwed up, hence the 8 p.m. walk, figuring I would cross the bridge into the city nearby. For further context, I'm a tall guy who's fairly athletic, and I was in my late 20s at the time. I'd rarely had a problem walking at night, and at the time, I felt safe to do so. I put on my headphones and headed towards the bridge. The first 20 minutes were uneventful. I passed by old houses, a subpar Mexican restaurant, a really good Mexican restaurant, a sketchy gas station, some newly built upscale apartments, and finally, I was at the river, enjoying the view of the bright lights over the dark flowing water, not yet frozen. I crossed the bridge into the city and hit a crosswalk button at a four-way intersection. Then noticed someone standing on the corner opposite, the only other soul I'd seen outside that night. Seemingly, she was doing nothing, and I assumed she was waiting for an Uber to come and pick her up, since she didn't seem to be waiting for the light to change. The street, ordinarily busy during the daytime, was silent. The light changed and I crossed, headed in her direction. As I neared her, I noticed that she would cast glances in my direction, then look away almost sheepishly. She did this multiple times, and I figured she was unnerved by me. I sympathized, figuring it would have made her uneasy, us being the only two people on a dimly lit street. As I passed by, I took in her outfit, mostly because I thought she looked cold. She wore a knitted hat with tassels, a sweater that looked too thin for the winter, tight jeans, and a little plastic children's backpack on her back. I thought she was in her teens at first, but upon closer inspection, she appeared to be in her late 20s, maybe 30s. She had short, cropped, light brown hair and a pale complexion. She was skinny and was of average height. I was maybe a head taller than her. I walked by and continued down the street. I passed by high-rise hotels on my right and left and made my way into a central park. During peak hours, this place would be packed with tourists and locals alike. But that day, at an odd hour, and with a pandemic in full swing, I felt like the only man in the city. I admired the brilliant display of lighted trees as I crossed through the center of the park. Then, figuring I was at a good halfway point in my journey, I made my way around an old marble and stone library, back towards the bridge. As I turned the corner of the library back onto the main street from which I'd come, I nearly collided with someone moving towards me. It was the same woman I had seen not even 10 minutes earlier. My noise-canceling headphones were still on, so I pulled down one side and said something by way of apology. She said nothing in return. Instead, she stepped back from me and stood below a streetlight, not making eye contact. She stole tiny glances at me, the same tick I'd noticed before. I put my headphones back on, nodded a good night, and headed towards the nearest crosswalk. Reason told me she must be headed in the same direction I'd come from, since we'd nearly run into each other, headed opposite ways. But some part of me whispered that she wasn't heading that way. Not sure enough, when I turned to look, she was trailing close behind me, her strides surprisingly long and energetic. I found this odd enough that I continued to watch her out of the corner of my eye. Shortly after I reached the crosswalk, as I stood there waiting for the light to change, she caught up with me, passed me by, and stopped. A car then passed, and as it did so, she squatted over her plastic bag a few meters from me, rifling frantically for something, looking up at me on occasion. I hit a button on my headphones, stopping my podcast, so that I could hear her better. What I found disturbing about the motion of her looking through her bag is that it struck me as fake, as though she were pretending for some reason. She was barely looking inside, and her careless motions struck me like bad acting. Something about her motions, the way she kept looking at me, felt wrong. The light changed and I began to walk away, but she was faster. She stood suddenly, darting past me towards the museum, swinging the half-open little pink backpack over her shoulder. I watched her silhouette disappear into the darkness beyond the reach of the streetlights. I hoped that was the end of that, and after a few beats of not seeing her, I let my guard fall a little, restarting my podcast. Beyond the museum was a patch of poorly lit sidewalk, in front of a squat building with mirror-like windows. I wasn't far from the bridge now. As I made my way back there, I turned my back to look at the reflection of the buildings and streetlights in the windows. To my horror, a dark figure sprinted silently towards my reflection, dreamlike. I'm not sure why, maybe out of sheer confusion, but I turned to meet her as she hurtled towards me. Perhaps surprised by my sudden turn, she halted mere feet from me, staring. Her eyes were wide and looked frantic, wild. She kept looking at my arms, then back at my face, as though sizing me up. My accidental bluff had worked, and in the darkness, I suppose I must have looked more prepared to fight than I felt. She gripped something small tightly in one hand, though she held it off to the side. And in the shadow of the building, I couldn't see exactly what it was. Seconds dragged as we stood there, staring at one another, immobilized by fear and confusion. I waited for her to make some move, to attempt to use whatever object was in her hand. Just then, to my enormous relief, a car trundled slowly past. A bit of my strength returned, and over my blaring podcast, I felt more than heard myself shouting at her. "What do you want?" No reply. I slowly backed away from her, expecting her to move. She just watched me, that same intense look on her face. I took another step back, then another, steadily backing away from her until I felt confident enough to turn and carefully walk away. As I reached a better lit area, I began to move faster, all the while keeping my eyes trained on her shadow form. She stood there for some time, statuesque. Then, abruptly, having spontaneously abandoned whatever plan she may have had for me, she turned from me, and, without looking for traffic, she crossed the street with long strides and disappeared around the corner of a building. Something about that casual air of it disturbed me. I kept my eyes trained behind me on my walk home, afraid that she would follow me. The bridge was well lit, and I saw no sign of her, knowing that this was the only way for her to follow me and keep up on foot. I breathed a sigh of relief. I saw no more cars head from the city, no more pedestrians out walking. Nothing happened after that. I'm not sure why, but I didn't call the cops that night. I still regret having not called, despite my roommates insisting I do so. I just remembered thinking that I wasn't sure what to say to the cops, that I hadn't really been attacked, that they would have been able to find her anyhow. I made up excuses. I suppose I must have been in shock, in denial at having been nearly ambushed, especially by someone smaller than me, in my own city, so close to my apartment. One of my roommates called the cops for me. A cop drove through the area, but by that point, she was gone. I watched my coworker get arrested and then found out he had a sinister plan for me. I had worked for this man for a little over 3 years. We worked pretty closely on some projects over the last 2 years and even sat near one another at work. In September, I showed up and saw about 10 detectives at my place of work. I was a bit startled, as this was quite unusual for my area. I looked around and saw that my coworker was in handcuffs and looked quite disheveled, which wasn't out of the norm, to be honest. I walked up to the detectives, introduced myself, and let them know who I was in relation to him. I asked what was going on, and they filled me in on why he was currently being arrested. For the sake of the case, I won't share more than he was a disgusting person. Over the course of the next 3 hours, I watched as they dismantled his workstation, went through his belongings, took evidence pictures, and so on. I was pulled in and out of rooms answering questions about his character, what I knew of him, and my feelings about him as a person. I told them he gave me a weird feeling in my gut, that I've always told my husband I wouldn't be surprised if the cops ever did come looking for him, that my husband even thought he was weird, and if I ever went missing, that he'd be the first person to be suspected. I didn't realize how real this almost was. The detectives on site told me that they served a search warrant at his home and were looking there for any evidence. It sounds like they found more than they anticipated and were looking to see if there was anything else unrelated to what they were currently investigating. I was asked my name and my husband's name for confirmation for something they found, which I did think was odd. But I let it go and called my husband to update him on the happenings of the day thus far. However, the last hour I was pulled in for the final time and advised by one of the lead detectives, who couldn't even look at me, that I needed to ensure I was safe and protected in the event they didn't book him that day. Come to find out, he had been journaling about me over the course of at least a year, saying he wanted to be with me, but the problem was that I was married. His journal then laid out a plan to set my husband up for cheating on me, and the end resulted in my death, caused by him, my coworker. The officer said that everything in between was more vile than he's ever heard, to the point he was crying when he was telling me to make sure I was safe. Crying. A detective. And didn't want to scare me. Thankfully, he was charged and was looking at a long, long time in prison. But I still think about it. It keeps me up at night. It just shows you never really know someone, even your coworkers. I was staying with my friend for a couple of weeks in the town I grew up in. She works at a restaurant. Without giving away too many details about the location, it's a plaza with a river nearby, a movie theater, restaurants, and boutiques. We entered through the parking garage on the bottom floor, which has 3 stories, both elevators and stairs. This is important. Her shift was about 6 hours, so I decided to do some shopping, listen to music, and walk around before eating at the restaurant my friend works at. I was sitting at the bar on the corner alone, listening to music. A bigger man approached me. He had a security guard beanie on that was incredibly dirty and tattered up. He was muttering, and his eyes were barely open. What I got from his muttering was, "Are you? I like your... Is someone sitting?" But keep in mind, it was incredibly muttered. I'm just guessing what he was trying to say. All of this was said while he was switching back and forth between looking into my eyes and staring at my chest. I told him multiple times I couldn't understand what he said. After a bit of back and forth, I put the headphones back around my neck and he left me alone. I told my friend about what happened immediately. I tried to shake it off, hoping it was an isolated incident. If this is where the story ended, I wouldn't be writing this, unfortunately. About an hour later or so, I see someone approach the bar to my left out of the corner of my eye, and I felt their eyes on me. I didn't look, but somehow I knew it was him. My heart started beating really fast. I texted my friend and told her I felt really sketched out. I wanted to believe that I was misreading things and was just letting anxiety get the best of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling. 30 minutes or so later, she gets off. As we walked toward the parking garage stairs to get to our car, I saw him sitting on a bench waiting for me. The benches aren't super close to the elevators. They're closer to the restaurant, if anything. The second I spotted him, my blood ran cold. He saw us walking towards the stairs to the parking garage and started running towards us. I was face to face with him by the time we got to the top of the stairs. We booked it back to the restaurant and used the employee elevator to get to her car, and an employee escorted us to the car as well. The employee told us that there are a lot of cases of homeless people who walk around the restaurant. So I presume he was homeless and just walking in and out of the restaurant until he saw me. I'm incredibly thankful I trusted my gut and that I saw him. I don't know what would have happened to us if I didn't see him at first, but I don't want to find out. And that, dear listeners, brings a close to these true scary stories and creepy encounters. Before I bring this to a close, I would like to acknowledge the rest of the membership of Back to Ashes. Thank you all so much for your continued support, as you are the glue that holds all of this together. I cannot express my gratitude enough. To the newbies and the peekaboos, and everybody who listens, thank you so much for supporting Back to Ashes. For without you, I wouldn't have a voice, and there would be no Back to Ashes YouTube channel. I appreciate you. If you are sleeping, I hope Slumberland is treating you comfortably. If you're awake, I hope you've enjoyed these collections. Until next time, please take care of yourselves. I'll be reading to you soon. Have yourself a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening. Peace, love, and light to you all.